All right, we're going into our last standalone presentation before the panel. Just want to remind you there's going to be a panel on Arctic marine transportation led by Dr. Lawson Brigham. So I hope that since the weather is so bad and terrible out there, we're not going to lose any of you. Hope to see you back at the panel. Next presentation is going to be given by Dr. Alyson Azzara. She's an international trade specialist with the U.S. Maritime Administration. Ali's going to be talking about divining the future, how Arctic shipping projections stack up to reality. I'm pretty good at divining the past myself, but the future is more difficult.
Hi, folks. Thanks for sticking with me. I know it's been a long session, so I'm honored to be batting cleanup, but I do realize that I'm between you and cookies. I do like cookies, so I'm going to do my best to get you there. This presentation is really a first look presentation. It's some new analysis that I'm doing. It's a reanalysis of a projections report that was published in 2015. So you guys are all actually the first people to see any of this. So I look forward to your comments and your questions. This is my legal disclaimer. If you need an actual copy, please let me know. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to review the 2015 projections report. I'm going to compare it with some actual data that we have from the Coast Guard, look at some of the assumptions that we used in our projections and see if they're still valid, talk about some of the differences, and then some thoughts for where we can go in the future. So the report is the 10-year projection of maritime activity in the U.S. Arctic region. It's a report that was done under the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation System. It was submitted to the White House by Secretary Fox of the Department of Transportation, and it was in response to one of the implementation tasks from the National Strategy on the Arctic region. The beauty of the document is that it's really a scenario-based document. So you can mix and match the numbers from any of the different assumptions to sort of meet what your questions are. We did use some modeling for ice forecasting, and we used that as a basis to figure out if you could even operate in the region. And then we also used AIS, Automatic Identification System data from 2011, 2012, and 2013 in order to look at areas of high concentration of shipping activity in the U.S. Arctic region. The middle image shows a red box, and that was the area of interest for this particular study. It's from just south of the Bering Strait, a little bit into Russia, and then over into Canada. So there were three major assumptions that we used for this report. The first one is that shipping will grow in the U.S. Arctic at a general rate that reflects global economic and regional growth. So we had low, medium, and high scenarios, and we used it based on a number of different sources of economic data. The second assumption is that vessels may divert from other traditional routes to use Arctic passages. So we looked at potential diversion from both the Suez and the Panama Canals. We focused on four types of vessels: bulk vessels, container vessels, tanker vessels, and general cargo vessels. And for the short period of July to November, we looked at 2%, 5%, and 8%, which is about 1%, 3%, and 5% for the total year. The projections we did included both container ships, and we did projections without container ships because, as many of you know, that's a fairly contentious issue. The third assumption had to do with oil and gas exploration. Continued oil and gas exploration will increase vessel traffic. And so we used the required numbers from BOEM and from NIMS and some of the industry projections for what might happen in the region. And we had projections that ranged from essentially no additional oil and gas activity with a baseline year of 2011 all the way up to several different exploration activities in the Beaufort and Chukchi. We didn't have development scenarios because the time horizon for development scenarios is about 15 to 20 years, which is beyond the time horizon for this report, which was only to look at the 10 years out to 2025. So we applied those assumptions to specific groups of vessels. The annual growth rates were applied only to container vessels, which did include general cargo vessels that would carry containers, to general cargo vessels, but not to the bulk carriers that are going to the Red Dog mine. Those were held constant for reasons we can discuss. We also looked at tugs and tankers. Other vessel classes that included research vessels, adventure, ecotourism, government, unknown, we held those constant at a 2013 level. And the last piece, I think that's particularly important given what we've been discussing, is that cruise vessels for the low and medium scenarios were held at 4 vessels. And for the high scenario, we used 6 vessels. And so we'll talk more about that. When you put all of those together, we have a conservative. The low combined estimate was for 420 vessels and about 877 transits. And so this image shows the 2011 business as usual, and then this is what it would look like in 2025 with that low. So you can see the areas in red are high, areas in blue are low, and there's fairly significant change. So the question for the reanalysis is, are the projections still reasonable? Did we do a good job? Did we totally miss the mark? Did we way screw up with our assumptions? And to answer that question, we started looking at actual data, which is my favorite kind of data, from the U.S. Coast Guard District 17 in Alaska. They've been keeping track of vessel activity in the region since 2008. Their area of interest is sort of up in the diamond in the map, and you'll see it doesn't overlap exactly with the area of interest that we used in 2015, but it's pretty close. I guess you would say it's close enough for government work. So there are 3 things to pay attention to on this particular slide. The first thing are that cargo and tugs, which are in black and red at the bottom, have pretty regular year-over-year increases in the numbers of vessels that are operating in the region. The other thing to pay attention to is for research science vessels, which are sort of at the top in yellow, unexpectedly, incredible increases in year-over-year activity in research vessels. If you look at the general trend, and you start in 2008 and you look at 2012, you could say it would be exponential growth. However, if you look from 2012 to 2016, you'll see that it's more of a flat line of growth. It's more regular growth, but it's more linear growth. And so as we go forward, a lot of what I'm going to focus on is sort of that more conservative approach using the 2012 to 2016 linear growth, because I like to be conservative in my estimates. So when you compare our growth rates, you can look specifically at the orange line towards the bottom and the dotted line that's right above the orange line. If you compare our 420 vessels, 420 vessels from our conservative estimate, and you break out and continue that line from 2012 to 2016 with a linear regression, we're almost bang on, which is super exciting because it means I did a good job. But it also leads to questions about, whether or not we could do better things, because you'll see that the other lines are kind of all over the place. So there's some questions about what we could have done better there. The really interesting thing is that our underlying assumptions for that low scenario didn't really hold. We had some oil and gas in there, but we also had some diversion from other routes in there. And as you all probably know, we didn't really see any diversion from other routes in the past few years. A little bit, but not much. So the question is really, what's going on? Where are all these vessels coming from? The 3 lines that are solid at the bottom are our low, medium, and high growth rates based on the GDP growth rates that we use for 1.3%, 3%, and 3.3%. The dotted lines show the regression analysis, the linear regression analysis using the 2008 to 2016 and the 2012 to 2016. So they're way above where those lines we thought would be, which suggests that the rate of growth that's happening in the U.S. Arctic region, to include some things that go over to Russia, is far above what we thought it would be. It's an area that's growing faster than the rate of the global growth. You can also look at vessel numbers by type, and I think that this is particularly telling. The 2 lines at the top are for cargo and tug vessels, which the cargo vessels are almost exponential in growth, and the tug vessels show very consistent growth in year over year. You can also look at research science vessels, which again, important for this group, are growing more than we thought they would. We thought that they would be constant. So when we think about cargo and tugs, those are the 2 areas that are growing. We can see it in both diagrams, and it's really a question of what's driving this and how much is being driven. The dotted line along the bottom is if you use the mid-range projection. If you use 3% of global growth, which is really what we kind of thought we were going with, we're way underneath where we are actually at in the U.S. Arctic region. The straight line is the linear extrapolation of the rate, and the curved line is the exponential extrapolation. So to go back, you can see that this is more of an exponential rate. This is more of a linear rate. So you've got exponential and linear. So who cares? Well, some sectors grew unexpectedly, and this is what's really neat about this. If you look at 2013, and I'm not sure that it shows up, but this dotted line is basically our baseline. We thought that these lines would be flat, all of them. They're not flat. So something's happening here that we didn't think was going to happen. The really cool thing is that our high estimate for cruise vessels was 6 vessels. We exceeded that last year. So when we think about where we thought we would be 2 years ago to where we are now, it's far above where we anticipated using all the best available information from the cruise industry itself. The research section could be, theoretically, all the way up here by 2025 if it continues at the same rate that it's currently going at. And you might say, well, do we have that many research vessels that are ice hardened that are capable? Globally, we do, and it's a possibility. So where are we now? If you take all of the information from the slides that I just showed you and you add it all up, you get 469 ships, which is really exciting for me because I thought there would be 420 ships. I did pretty good. But it doesn't include oil and gas, and we know that that's a possibility, particularly with the new administration and some of the things that have been going on the North Slope, some of the exploration, some of the discoveries. It doesn't also include any possible diversion, and if you've been following the news and listening to China and Korea and some of the international folks, they really are focusing on the Northern Sea Route as a potential way to move goods across the Arctic. It also holds the bottom categories constant. And we know from the past that when I hold things constant, it doesn't always work out so well. So this is truly a conservative estimate going forward. It's also interesting to look at the number of vessels versus the number of transits. You would think that the number of vessels, you'd have maybe about double for transits. What goes up has to come down. It's not always true. And what's more interesting about it is that you can have a really small interannual variability in the number of vessels operating, and that can create a large variability in the number of transits vis-a-vis the amount of activity. If you're thinking about risk planning and you're thinking about response planning, it may be that the activity and the number of transits is actually more important for your planning than what the number of vessels tells you. So this is important to keep in mind when we think about modeling for the future and assessing the needs in the region. It's not just the total number of vessels, but what are they actually doing up there and how much are they doing up there? So some of the factors that impact projections, we've sort of gone through this. Oil and gas and resource development are huge. One of the major assumptions in the 2015 report is that there would be no deep draft port in the US Arctic within that 10-year time period. So that's something to consider. If there is a deep water port, how does that change what's happening? If there's a deep draft port, how does that change what's happening? How does the location of that change what's happening in the region? We also know that changes in tourism are happening at a different rate than we thought that they would. And the same is true for science. There's a lot more activity up there, which means that we need to be prepared for what that means in terms of response capabilities and support capabilities and infrastructure. So what's a better approach? I know what we did in 2015. I know what I can do looking at a quick look at how we did with those numbers. So how can we do it better? Well, we need to be able to better characterize and categorize the vessels. Knowing who's up there and what they're doing and how long they're going to be there for is super helpful in trying to figure out what that activity is going to look like. The same thing is true for different sectors in the industry. You need to be able to understand what's happening with oil and gas, what's happening with natural resources, but you also need to understand what's happening with tourism and cruise vessels and everything else that's going on in the region. And this is really underscored by having a benefit of better and more complete historical data. The data that we used for the 2015 report was right on the cusp of where AIS data was just getting its feet under it. So the accuracy and the availability of data going forward is going to greatly exceed what we were able to use just a couple of years ago. And that goes to be true for access to more complete data sets. So now that we have more partners that are globally looking at this, we have the ability to look at broader data sets and information that may not have been available. And we have more eyes on the issue. You can have a broader conversation, you can have more context for what's happening, and you can have better partnerships. And I think one of the most important things is to remember that we have to continue to look past red herrings. It's really easy to get caught up in the sexy thing that's happening this year, whether it's a giant cruise ship that's going through the Arctic or it's a groundbreaking oil and gas exploration activity. But there are day-to-day regular operations that are happening in the region. They're going for community resupply. They're going for all kinds of other commercial activities, and understanding those and really having an awesome handle on what it is that those operations are doing is going to make it much easier to plan in the event of an emergency situation. I use the conservative numbers because I'm really not interested in what might happen in a pie in the sky scenario. I really want to know what we can count on having to deal with going forward. And so with that, I will take your questions and your comments and possibly your complaints.
Thank you, Ali. We have about 5 minutes for questions. There's one up there. Paul, wait for the microphone, Paul. Oh, were you yawning or raising your hand? I'm sorry. Okay.
Oh.
I got busted, sir.
That's the reaction I get from my wife.
So, are you going to revise the report
So I think
based on the fact that you have a lot of new information?
yes, so I think the goal of this reanalysis is to look more in depth. This is just sort of scratching the surface, and to provide a shorter reevaluation of what we did well and what we think might change in the future. Yes.
Hi. Did you break out your analysis by month? Like, is it all for September, or is some of this August, July? What's the seasonality of it?
So we used the time period from July through November, and we took a look at the total vessels in the area. When we were doing the overlay for the AIS information, it was a patchwork because of the incomplete data availability. So for some years, we had all 4 months, and then others we had like the first 2.5 or 3, and then we had some overlap. So we were looking at total numbers as reported, but the maps that you see with the heat maps are based only on AIS data as it was available. And that's something we'd like to really work on, making that a better analysis.
Thanks. I have an online question. Why did you exclude ships to Red Dog in your annual growth rates in the model?
So the Red Dog mine has been consistently serviced by somewhere between 23 and 25 bulk carriers every year. Based on their plan, their business plan, that's anticipated to stay at a steady state. So while we need to understand, that's one that we have a pretty good handle on, and so we know we don't anticipate growth for those vessels.
Thank you. One more. Did you categorize the multiple NOAA-funded HELI cruises, ECS, Extended Continental Shelf Mapping Expeditions, as research?
They would either be research or government vessels. I'd have to go back into the data and work with the Coast Guard to figure out where they categorize those specific vessels.
Thanks. And finally, adventurers equals recreational, question mark?
Yes, so I think the more adventures, and those are pretty steady state, are the smaller vessels as opposed to the cruise ship and the cruise industry. I think that's how they divide them.
Thanks. Any other questions? This one up here.
Thank you. Nice job, Ali. Were you able to factor into this reanalysis the news about the LNG shipping that's beginning from the Yamal Peninsula down through the Bering Strait and down to China? I can't remember the number, but I think that the announcement for this indicated that the Koreans are planning to build at least 10 of these carriers in order to serve this demand in China.
So thank you. One of the changes in our assumption was that we thought that tanker vessels originally in the 2015 analysis would grow at about the same rate as the global growth, and they actually declined over that period of time. So going forward, we looked at basically an average number of vessels and held that constant. It's a good point because they're sort of building vessels and we don't really know what's going to happen with that. sort of the quote conservative way to go is to hold that steady and then in a couple of years reevaluate what's actually happening. There's also a lot of discussion about how the change from construction to extraction is going to shift the type of vessels that are along the Russian coast. And so that's something that we need to think about too when we're looking at the cargo numbers versus the tanker vessel numbers, that could shift in the future because of a change in activity and just what's happening in the region.
All right, thank you, and thank you, Ali. I believe the guys and gals are, with glasses are winning. Yeah.